Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1979 film Dracula. Now, for me personally, this is honestly arguably the most underrated and overlooked adaptation of Dracula that exists. Because when it comes to Dracula and film adaptations, this is not one that gets talked about or is honestly as revered as others. People talk about the 1931 film with Bela Lugosi. They talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman and directed by Francis Ford Coppola. They talk about Horror of Dracula, the first film in the Christopher Lee Dracula series. But they don't really mention this film in the same capacity. And I don't really think that's fair because, in all honesty, this is my second favorite Dracula movie. I really enjoy this particular adaptation. And I've always been a fan of this one. I rented it from the local library when I was a teenager, and it surprised me then, and I enjoyed it a lot. And it's one of those films that, while I haven't seen it over and over and over again, it's still a movie that I do find a lot of joy in, despite, the darker subject matter, the fact that it's about a undead count who's sucking people's blood and essentially leading people to a life of immortal blood drinking. But it's still one of those things where there is a lot of fun to be had with this particular version of Dracula. In a lot of ways, it's kind of like a big budget B movie take on Dracula, and I can see why that's something that really makes people not a big fan of this one, but I think that just adds to the entertainment value of this version of Dracula. And it's also a film that just has a lot more considerable strengths than a lot of people give it credit for. And one of them is definitely the visuals. Now, before I start talking about the direction by John Badham, I want to talk about something briefly, which is the difference between the theatrical version of this film and the version that was released on DVD and Blu-ray until the most recent release by Scream Factory. Because prior to Scream Factory's release, which included the theatrical version with the original color timing, the only version you could find on DVD and Blu-ray in high definition was John Badham's preferred director's edition. Which, to me, this director's edition was one of those rare instances of a director's preferred vision of a film that was massively inferior. And it wasn't necessarily because of the way that it was edited or written or anything like that. It's essentially the same film, narrative-wise, as the theatrical version, but with one very major difference, which is the fact that the color was completely sapped out, and the film has this very bland and dull look to it. Like it's some kind of old-timey photograph from back in like the 1900s or 1800s. And I think that was the intention. Like John Badham, he wanted the film, I guess, to look like that in 1979, but he just didn't have the right technology or the right things that he could use to make the film look like that. So this was his attempt to make the dream version of Dracula, But to me, he made it worse. He made it significantly worse because the version I remembered was the version that I saw on VHS. And then when I saw the film on DVD, I was just really shocked by the way that it looked. And for a short amount of time, it made me question myself, like, was this always the way Dracula looked? Was it always this devoid of color? I distinctly remember watching the VHS, and there was a lot of color, and it was very vivid, and it had some really just luscious cinematography, and it was just a really nice looking film with a lot of color and vibrancy, as well as shadows and darkness, and a lot of really wonderful gothic atmosphere. And thankfully, after watching that version and then going online and forums, I was able to get the proof that I needed that I wasn't insane, and that the original version of the film that was on VHS was full of color. But even then, like, until this release, you could only see that version on VHS or on Laserdisc, and neither version was even in widescreen. So when Scream Factory came out with their release, fans of this film got to see this movie in a way that, unless you saw in the theater, they never got the opportunity to see. And it was so special. It made me love the film even more because I was able to just see so much of the film's just spectacular cinematography. I was able to appreciate John Badham's direction even more. It was just a much more immersive and fun experience because there wasn't that distraction of watching something that was messed around with after the fact, with post-processing, and looked a certain way that it really didn't to begin with. So all that being said, now I can segue into my thoughts on John Badham's direction. And I think he did a great job. I do. I think John Badham is a very solid director. This film is no exception. There are some really standout shots in this. A lot of them involve Dracula climbing up the side of a building, or Dracula floating outside a window, or one shot in particular I thought was just brilliant is Dracula is actually floating upside down and scratching at the window to be let in. And I just thought that the way that that whole scene was shot was just amazing. And there's quite a few other sequences that are also really well shot in this film. When you first get to see Carfax Abbey and you get the first glimpse of Dracula's abode, it's a really cool looking shot. It's a great establishing shot. And overall, yeah, it's a very wonderful, nice looking film with some great use of color and shadow and light mixed together to really create some very eye-popping, eye-catching visuals. John Badham definitely did have a lot of floaty camera work. There were some shots where it seemed like he actually was flying the camera around through the sky or throughout the scene. And I felt the floatiness of it just really fit the film so well because it had this very dreamlike quality to it at times. So it just made everything even more surreal and special in terms of the visuals. And it made scenes that were supposed to be very sensuous and sexy legitimately feel that way. And there's some really trippy moments in this too, in terms of the direction. Like the first love scene, it's this psychedelic trip, and I just love the way that whole scene is shot. So yeah, it's a really well shot film by John Badham. Then we get to the script by W.D. Richter, which is loosely based on Bram Stoker's novel as well as the stage play. And I honestly think this is one of the best scripts when it comes to an adaptation of the stage play or the novel, because it's one of those screenplays that, while it's not 100% accurate to the source material, it does enough things where it injects some really genuine new blood into the narrative and plays around with conventions enough that it really makes it into something unique. And it feels like it's its own different breed of Dracula. I like the way that the film opens up with Dracula arriving from Transylvania on the Demeter. His ship crashes. He's saved by Mina, who in this film is related to Van Helsing. And the Count then has this wonderful dinner with Mina and her friends at Dr. Seward's clifftop mansion, and he charms the pants off of everybody. And I love the way that W.D. Richter writes Dracula, because he writes Dracula in a way where he seems relatively unassuming and harmless initially. He seems like he's just a suave, cool count who you want to get to know better, you want to get on his good side, you want to help him out. And that's what makes the moments when he bares his fangs, when he starts manipulating people with his hypnotic eyes, or when he just becomes more violent, it makes those moments all the more effective. And I think this script is honestly the best that I've seen when it comes to making Dracula not only a sympathetic figure, but also a figure that you can see yourself connecting with on a more human level. I think a lot of the other Dracula adaptations, they focused more on the animal nature of Dracula. And I think the 1931 film had moments where it tried to do that, with Dracula being more suave and sophisticated, but it just didn't really come across nearly as well as it does here. So I just love that scene. I love the way that it's written. I just love the whole way it plays out with Dracula at the dinner table and just charming the pants off of everybody. And Lucy falls for him, but of course her fiance Jonathan Harker is not happy about this. And that's another change that they do here. Jonathan Harker is Lucy's fiance instead of being Mina's fiance. Lucy and Jonathan, they're having a moment with one another while they're doing that, and they're doing their thing. Dracula then descends upon Mina and shows up at her door and seduces her and drinks her blood. Mina, the next day, she's having a hard time breathing, and then Lucy watches Mina die. So that's another element of the script that is very different from these other versions of Dracula. Mina is the one that dies and is Dracula's first victim and becomes a vampire. So Lucy is understandably distraught. She's also wondering why Mina has these wounds on her throat. She blames herself for her friend's death because she left her alone. Dr. Seward calls in Mina's father, Professor Van Helsing, to because he he needs a little extra help. And also, having Mina's father there at this point in time would be good for Mina. And of course, Van Helsing, he suspects that a vampire killed Mina. And then now he worries about what fate his dead daughter might have. So Seward and Van Helsing investigate their suspicions. They discover a Mina's coffin. It's empty. They go through an opening near the coffin, and they wind up in the mines. They didn't find Mina, and then they wind up having to kill her. But the way that they do that is different too, because they don't kill her right away. They just put a cross on her forehead and get her to essentially retreat. And then they get her in her coffin the next morning. And then they cut her heart out. You don't actually see her heart get cut out, but it's implied. And I thought that was very different. Instead of like staking through the heart, use a scalpel and pull out her heart and destroy the heart that way. And at this point in time, Dracula is also in love with Lucy, and he puts her under his spell. And I like the way that the scenes between Dracula and Lucy are also written. The two of them have some really good chemistry. You really do buy that they become romantically involved, and in a lot of ways it actually turns into a genuine love story, almost to the point where you kind of root for Dracula in a way. You're like, you know what, maybe he's not that bad of a guy. Yeah, he's done some awful things, but he's trying to survive, that kind of thing. Dracula winds up putting you under his spell until you eventually snap out of it. You're like, no, he needs to be destroyed, and it sucks that he's gonna lose the connection with Lucy, because they seem like they're a great couple, but it's just he's just too much of a terror to remain alive. And the script even has moments where, even though he's suave and he's sophisticated and he's well mannered, and you buy that he's this leading man type who is seducing Lucy, and she's falling in love with him, and it does have moments where he shows his darker side, where he's more violent and mean, and that really comes out when he's facing off against Jonathan Harker. And Jonathan Harker is also a character that I think is written better in this than he is in honestly any other adaptation that I've seen. Harker actually feels like he has more to do. Harker feels like he's more of a concrete, important part of the plot, more than just the guy who's going to marry Mina, who then teams up with a bunch of other guys to try to take out Dracula. I like the fact that he's the one that's taking a lot of action. He's the one that's deciding to try to take out Dracula with the help of Van Helsing, but ultimately Van Helsing, even though he's the one that essentially gets the hook into Dracula at the end of the film, which that's another thing that I liked about this script, is that in the climax, it takes place on the boat. It takes place on a ship that's already out to sea, and that really helps build some genuine tension, because it's like, oh shit, Dracula's already gone. Like, they go to his castle, and they try to corner him there, but he's outsmarted them. He's like, I ain't staying there, and he's already on his way to Transylvania. So now it's a race against time, and Harker and Van Helsing, they get on the ship, and they get into one last confrontation with Dracula. And here's another thing about the script that I thought was really unique and very ballsy. Van Helsing gets impaled by Dracula, and he's the one that sends a hook into Dracula that winds up sending Dracula up into the sunlight, but he dies. Van Helsing sacrifices himself in this version of Dracula to save Lucy and Jonathan, and he doesn't make it. And I thought that was just really nice. It was a great change of narrative structure right there. Definitely threw me for a loop. I wasn't expecting that. And the ending's ambiguous. It's kind of insinuated that Dracula died due to exposure to sunlight, but it's also insinuated that maybe he survived, because that's what I meant by saying it's kind of insinuated that he died, because his cape flutters off into the wind, and you can maybe think, well, maybe he turned into a bat, and the cape is flying around because the bat's inside. Maybe he used enough of his power to escape. So you could set up a potential sequel, because I'm pretty sure Universal, if this film was more of a success, they would have made another one. But that's another thing that I think works for this kind of film. And it was a cool shot too, of the cape that was just floating around in the wind. And of course, Lucy smiles because her lover is potentially still alive, and there's a chance that they might meet again one day. But yeah, I really like this script. I think it's a really nice take on the Dracula mythos. It takes a lot of creative differences, but that's to the benefit of the film. It really makes it its own thing, instead of just another adaptation of the stage play or another adaptation of the novel. It's just trying to be as close to the source material as possible. No, it plays fast and loose with both, but I think that's a big reason why it's such a daring and fun film, is because of the fact that the script does take all these chances. And there are some other things about the script that I want to mention that I don't necessarily know if these are script things that are the result of the screenwriter and his ideas, but I didn't know where else to talk about them. I like the way that the vampires look in this, at least the vampires that are turned by Dracula, not Dracula himself. Especially Mina. You don't normally see in a film like this the vampires look so inhuman or monstrous, at least not in Dracula films. So I really liked the way that Mina looks when she's in the mines. Her skin is just pale, and it's flaky, and she looks horrible, and she's got these really creepy, beady black eyes with red pupils. It's a really striking image. And I like the fact that the script also has moments where Dracula shows his animosity, shows his ferocity by turning into a wolf, but not in a way where they overdo it. I like how a lot of the moments with Dracula where he's being a force to be reckoned with is in his human form. He's not turning into a bat. There's like a one scene where he did that with Renfield, but a lot of the time he's doing stuff with his bare hands, or he's manipulating people with his mind. So, yeah, overall, I do. I think it's an excellent script by W.D. Richter. He did a wonderful job. The film also features a really stellar cast. Frank Langella is fantastic as Dracula. Honestly, I would say Gary Oldman is still my favorite Dracula, but Langella is a very close second to me. I found his performance to be mesmerizing and just hard to take my eyes off of. It was one of those performances where every word that came out of Langella's mouth as this character was just so genuine and strong and just left its mark. And the only moments where this take on Dracula, his interpretation of the character, didn't work for me were things that really honestly weren't entirely his fault. There's a moment near the end on the ship where Dracula is being cornered by Harker and Van Helsing, and he's growling, and he sounds like a angry pit bull, and it's laughable. And I think Badham asked Langella to make growling noises with his mouth, and it was just really silly. But other than that, Langella though, he's just lovely. He's just a great performance. Just a really mesmerizing, magnificent take on the character. The sensuality of the performance is second to none when it comes to cinematic Dracula, and when he needed to be ferocious and intimidating, I felt he did a great job with that as well. And yeah, it was just a really great take on the Count, and he and Kate Nelligan had some really great chemistry. You bought the romantic timing and the romantic fire, so to speak, between the two of them, and it made the scenes where they're playing off one another all the more special and worthwhile. Rest of the cast is also great. We got Laurence Olivier, who plays Van Helsing, even though his accent's a little at times. Still a good performance by a very established, seasoned veteran actor, Donald Pleasence. He's in this as Dr. Seward, and it's another great, quirky, fun Donald Pleasence performance. Kate Nelligan, she not only was really good in the scenes with Frank Langella, but she was good in scenes with Jonathan Harker or with anyone else. And overall, I thought it was a really solid performance by her all the way around. Jan Francis as Amina, she was fine. I wouldn't say she was great, but she was fine, though. Trevor Eve, honestly, I really liked his performance as Jonathan Harker. This is definitely, in my opinion, the best Jonathan Harker performance on screen is Trevor Eve. Gave me like Cary Elwes vibes, which is interesting because Cary Elwes, I believe he was in the Bram Stoker's Dracula film from 1992. But yeah, it gave me kind of Cary Elwes vibes, and it worked, and he really held his own well with the rest of the cast. And I also want to mention Tony Hygarth, who played Renfield, because I think his portrayal of Renfield is also really underrated. It's a very different look for Renfield. Like, he's got a beard, and he looks more like a sailor, but it worked well because Tony made it his own. He really did. So, yeah, a really solid cast. Then you have some gorgeous, just absolutely stunning cinematography by Gilbert Taylor. Some excellent editing by John Bloom, especially in the scenes involving Dracula climbing up the walls of buildings or floating into windows, or the moments where Dracula transforms from man to beast. And I cannot talk about this film without talking about the absolutely stupendous score by John Williams, which is, in my opinion, without a doubt, his most underrated score. His score for this film is fantastic. It is sweeping, it is epic, it is just full of gothic wonder and awe, and it's just a really, really, absolutely astonishing score. It's one of those pieces of music that like you could listen to on its own, and it just evokes a certain mood and atmosphere, and it just elevates the film to a higher level and to heights that it never would reach otherwise, because the score is just that good. Um, John Williams is a master of his craft and is widely considered by many to be one of the best composers to ever work in the film industry. But this is one of those scores that, for whatever reason, has fallen between the cracks, and I definitely don't feel deserves that. So this film is worth watching at least once just for this score, just to see it matched up with the visuals on the screen. So yeah, I don't really know what else to say about this version of Dracula, except it didn't do as well when it comes to the box office as Universal would have liked. They put a lot of marketing into this, like massive billboards, posters on skyscrapers, and they really went all out with trailers and TV spots and everything. They tried to make this like the film event of 1979, and it just really didn't pan out. It made a profit and it got some decent reviews, but it wasn't the smash hit that Universal was expecting it to be. I don't know how much their advertising budget was, but it had to be pretty astronomical, because this is a film that prior to its release, it was just marketed like crazy, like a marketing blitz, almost on the same level as something like Batman in 1989. Not quite, but not that far off either. And whatever reason, it just didn't really lead to that significant of a financial success. It did decently on home video though, and it's a film that absolutely garnered a cult following as the years went by. But yeah, all I have to say about Dracula is definitely recommend this one. It's one of those films that I feel, if you're a fan of the genre, if you're a fan of vampire films, you owe it to yourself to watch it at least once. It might not be your cup of tea. Like I said, it's like the B-movie version of Dracula with a lot of 70s aesthetic and style. But if you like 70s style and you want to see a more sensuous, a more suave, sophisticated, but also still pretty badass Dracula, I would recommend sinking your teeth into this one for sure. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Dracula from 1979. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later. See ya.